So that one man-made artificial system is having an impact across the entire world. And the other system is Mother Gaia, with infinite diversity, constant change, an interdependence and flow that, as we know, nothing has a static separate existence. Everything is in this flow and dialogue. So to come back in these deep connections between humans and that living Mother Gaia, it needs to be localized.
Welcome to Point of Relation with Thomas Hübl, a podcast that illuminates the path to collective healing at the intersection of science and mysticism. This is the Point of Relation.
Helena Norberg-Hodge, Director of Local Futures, is an award-winning pioneer of the New Economy movement and a co-founder of the International Forum on Globalization and the Global Eco-Village Network. She is author of the best-selling Ancient Futures, of Local is Our Future, and producer of The Economics of Happiness, Planet Local, and Closer to Home films.
Hello and welcome to Point of Relation. My name is Thomas Hübl and I'm very happy to welcome Helena Norberg-Hodge. A warm welcome, Helena. I'm happy that you are with us.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yes, so Helena, we are all doing our work, and I know you do your work for a long time. You have a lot of impact in the world, and as we go along, we constantly keep updating our work. And I always have new things that I'm excited about, and so those new things give me also fuel to unfold my own creativity, even though the body of work is there already for some decades. And I'm curious about you. So when you what's the leading edge, or what's the edge of your own work that keeps you creative, fresh, excited about what you do? So where is that at the moment for you?
Well, in a way, it hasn't changed that much. But what's happening is that I've ended up for almost 50 years promoting what I call localization, particularly with a focus on food. And this is actually now a worldwide movement. So every day I get some kind of information that nourishes me, because these local food systems are very nourishing, both spiritually and physically, for people around the world. So seeing that despite the heavy weight of a techno economy that works against it, from the bottom up, there are these initiatives that are healing people and places. So that's what keeps me going. And also forever, from my earliest years, a love for nature, and nature being my sort of healing place every day.
That I can also feel immediately when you talk about nature. It's like you transmit the love that you feel for nature. That's beautiful. So tell me, you said something that immediately catches my attention. You said that people and places heal. Can you share a bit more how people and places heal through localizing economy?
Yeah, it's particularly clear around the local food economies, where we've helped in various ways to encourage the reconnection between consumers and farmers by encouraging the setting up of new farmers markets, of what's called community supported agriculture. I've come to see it as, deep in our DNA, that in our whole evolution, we were connected to the land, to the plants, to the animals that nourished us, and that there is something extremely deep and, archetypical going on here, why people respond as dramatically as they do, and why I've even found that new markets where it's only food and local people come every week, it also becomes this cultural center that's very alive and beautiful, and where we have communities paying in advance to a farmer, for the whole year and supporting that farmer through floods, through droughts, through winds, that coming together between people and the land, the people who grow it, and this economic activity, which is the only activity that's providing for something we all need every single day of our lives. And then, we're sort of catalyzing these movements by alerting people to the fact that our governments are wedded to an outdated idea about growth through trade, and they're actually distancing us further and further from the source of our food. And it turns out that this global food economy is the biggest contributor to climate change, pollution, cancer, epidemic of diabetes and heart disease, obesity. So it turns out that the opposite direction is actually the cause of tremendous ecological and human suffering and declines. So it's a very, very significant direction.
Oh, yeah, it sounds like. I mean, I want to learn more, of course, from you, but immediately what comes up in me, like when I compare it to the work that we do on trauma or also systemic trauma, like how trauma creates a disembodiment and a disconnect in our sensing capacity between us and nature. That's why many people see themselves like separate if we don't feel that connection that you're speaking about. And most probably that also contributes to a global economy system that is also expressing this kind of disconnect. And when I listen to you and I hear you talk about the reconnection to the food locally, it feels in my body like something can relax and is much more grounded again in the local system. Doesn't mean that the global system doesn't exist, but it feels like very healthy in my body when I hear you speak about it. And I think that's also, there is a correlation between the kind of trauma, stress, and disconnect to a disconnected economy system, like disconnected from the local source. And I'm curious, when you see communities healing, because I'm very much interested in healing, also systemic healing. So when you saw communities healing, what are the signs that how would you frame that healing? Like, how did you recognize that something's healing, and how does that feel like, or what data do you have about it? Like, maybe you can describe that a bit.
Yeah, in lots of different ways. So, for one thing, we did a study quite a few years ago, and it showed that people have something like 10 times more conversations in farmers markets than they do in the supermarket. And when you actually look at the experience of rushing through the supermarket versus the slowing down, the intergenerational nature of the whole farmers market experience, it's quite remarkable, the difference. It's quite black and white. Also, we have this wonderful thing happening, which is that the farmers have often been, if you like, quite conservative in the sense they've been now pushed for generations to use fossil fuels and toxic chemicals that came out of the war machine to apply to the land, told that this is the way to grow more food, to be efficient. They've been pressured to become bigger and bigger, use more and more energy, go into debt to buy more technology. And they're struggling. Small farmers worldwide can't survive. In the beginning, when we suggest setting up a farmers market, they can often be quite resistant, quite skeptical. But it's so beautiful to see. And some of them even saying, I've been a farmer all my life, and we were pressured, to just do bigger and bigger scale, and every product an identical size. And of course, they were encouraged to do monoculture, just one thing. Now, suddenly in the farmers market, it's like another galaxy, it's another world. And it's interesting that typically the consumers are more left-leaning, green. And now suddenly these conservative farmers are being, in communication with people who actually, of course, don't care if every apple is the same size. But even more, a little blemish is almost a symbol that they haven't used chemicals. So they're now in this opposite situation where they're not being asked to do something completely unnatural and unhealthy. And the diversification is a protection against, one drought or one wind destroying everything, and on and on. In the supermarket, they get maybe 10% of what we pay, and in the farmers market, they get 100% of what we pay. And yet, all of these farmers markets are only possible essentially because of goodwill from middle-class people who can afford to support something, who have the time to help set it up. And all kinds of constraints that make it almost miraculous that these things are still happening and still growing. And they are. It's not nearly as fast as it could be, with a little bit of help from government or from the media, which is at the moment not helping. But also, I guess the other thing I've seen is prisoners healed almost overnight by the combination of being in deeper conversation in community. So curating that deeper conversation where you can be vulnerable, where you can be imperfect, where you can talk about your problems and still feel appreciated, feel loved. And combining that with helping them to learn to grow food. And again, the appreciation from local people for that food, it's suddenly miraculously healing. So even hardened prisoners will show you and tell you about how magic it's been for them to go through a program that allows for this. And these kinds of things are happening more and more. What's a bit infuriating is that it's not happening with the help of government or, like I say, the mainstream. It's all bottom up. But in a sense, that also gives me more faith in humanity, more faith in a deeper DNA drive to come back. I see it as coming back on track with evolution. In our evolution, we were only able to survive because of deep interdependence in a larger community, way beyond the nuclear family, but in smaller economic units where there was more accountability and visibility and adaptation to place, to diverse ecosystems, to the fabric of life that's constantly changing, that never remains static. And so this dialogue and this dance between human life and the diversity of the beyond human life is how we evolved, and we need to come back on track, because the trauma of, through slavery and enclosures, being forced away from the land to go into cities to become cogs in an industrial machine, or as slaves onto big monocultures to produce for elsewhere. All that trauma, by the way, is why I maintain that in psychiatry, we've never studied healthy people. We've only studied traumatized people who are driven away from nature and away from their human right to real community, to real interdependence. Don't know what you say about that.
No, this sounds like there are so many things. Like I'm exploding. I have so many follow-up questions. I want to stay. I will sequence those. So first of all, as I said, in me, my sense in my body, which I trust very much, like when I listen to you, it gives me a very organic, grounded feeling. And I think also a lot of mental health issues are not mental health issues. They are issues that are also in our body, and they express themselves maybe in our mental well-being, but they're not separate. So I think even that grounding effect that I feel when I listen to you is also part of the healing process for many things that you mentioned. So that makes a lot of sense for me just by listening to you. And then I'm wondering, let's say we are in that kind of globalized big system, international system. If one listens to you now and says, okay, I want to contribute to that. I want to contribute to the localization of the food production, let's say. What are steps that somebody can do that feels inspired, that feels, listen, this makes sense to me intuitively. I feel that that's right. Like, what are the next steps that we can do as people that get inspired by you or by your work? Um, what would you
Yeah,
suggest?
yeah. I mean, we sort of like to leave people with 5 words, and one of them is reconnect. The other one is rethink. The other one is resist and renew and rejoice. So the reconnect word, we're urging people to try to change the I to a we. So we think the best thing to do is to identify a friend, could be family, could be someone in the workplace, or a few people who would be interested in exploring a path which can take you towards both personal and planetary healing. So we're sort of offering that as a big promise, that we're saying that through understanding better the globalizing path, which has been a path of disconnection, both from one another, from ourselves, from the land, this path of reconnection really truly offers benefits even right away. We're not being helped to understand how much we suffer from the isolation that we've been pushed into, and it's got worse and worse with social media, as we know. So the reconnect is then also to identify some people together then to start a journey of reconnection to nature. And that can often be things like DIY Vision Quest. You don't have to spend thousands of dollars to actually benefit from some of the practices that have been clearly, that have been developed and that are helping people to do that deeper reconnection to nature. And when it's combined with what's happening all over the world now, people in circle, having a deeper dialogue, deeper listening, being able to express their vulnerability, their imperfection. We are imperfect. Every bit of life is imperfect. And we don't realize how much we've been tyrannized by this artificial pretense at perfection through the media and so on. So anyway, then we urge people as one of the most practical and beneficial things they can do to start healing both person and planet is to help build up the local food economy, which has, again, I could go on and on just about that, because the multiple benefits really only become clear when you understand that the global food economy is the most insanely wasteful, polluting, toxic process, and that our governments are wedded to encouraging this madness. And it's the epidemic of obesity and diabetes. It's that, trans fats, it's sugar, responsible for most of our health issues. And it's all coming out of this globalized corporate food system. So then once you see the outlines of that, the healing path becomes so much more important and so much clearer. And then, we're urging people to be willing to both resist and renew, to articulate their opposition to a continued globalization, and to do that without anger, without demonization. There are no individual enemies. It's a system that we have unwittingly gone along with in many different ways, and it can be very healing also personally to move away from the self-blame that is often part of the dominant narrative, particularly in the climate narrative now. It's just terrible what's happening. And so, be willing to resist and be part of this renewal through localization, which also requires international collaboration, both between movements, climate and other movements, and between governments. So there's a whole agenda that's also a political one that could rescue all of us, to take us on track towards evolution again, instead of being often unwittingly supporting a path towards AI being romanticized and essentially a path of war, both war literally, but also war against life, So, yeah, I feel we offer something that can be deeply empowering and that can allow us to be clearly resisting as well as renewing. And we are also constantly reminding people of the need to rejoice, to engage in practices that lead to that relaxation you were talking about, that deep breath that allows your whole body to relax. And I'm very interested in meditation that can often involve movement. Or I discovered that in Indigenous cultures, chanting and singing together was a daily practice virtually that I'm trying to also encourage people to bring back. So there are many lessons from Indigenous culture that are eminently practical and very helpful.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I also, so one aspect that I hear is also that local food production also helps us to get off the addiction to processed or ultra processed food, because it reduces that and reconnects us again to the products, to the local products that are simply much better for our health and our body. So that's one effect I hear. And the other big effect, besides many that you said, is that the climate impact of local production is simply very different than the climate impact of global production and all the transportation and all the side effects that come with it. So these are two very powerful aspects. And then the grounding aspects. And I think that's also in the trauma or collective trauma work, we would also say that nature is one of the big resources for us. And I think being reconnected to nature is a very healing experience, or can support that healing experience. It's not the only thing we need to do, but I think that's a good resourcing platform for a lot of healing that can happen. And then together with contemplative practices, as you said, or other practices, that's fantastic. Maybe you want to share with us a little bit what inspired you when you saw because I know you learned also a lot from the indigenous population, and maybe you can share a few, I don't know, of the main points that you learned that you feel impacted also your life and your work.
Yeah, well, so my background was I'm mainly Swedish, but partly German, partly English. I had family in all three countries, and I had lived in America. And I had already started looking at the differences between America and Europe, and questioned why there was more violence and more unhappiness, essentially, in America than in Europe at that time. And I realize now, so partly those experiences informed me and made me open to seeing the changes that I experienced when I was invited to go to Ladakh, or Little Tibet, in 1975. And I thought I was going out for 6 weeks, but it became a lifetime. I encountered there people this is the western part of Tibet that belongs politically to India, and it had been sealed off from outsiders for the whole modern era. And it was suddenly thrown open to development and progress. And I encountered people who were the most vital and actively happy people I'd ever seen, the healthiest people I'd ever seen. There was no poverty as we know it even in America, in the West. There was no unemployment, had never existed. Suicide was something that maybe would have happened one in a generation, an old person. And I witnessed over a 10-year period this multi-pronged process of now in the modern era using seduction through media, through schooling, that made people feel backward and stupid if they worked on the land, that made them feel useless and backward if they didn't belong to this urban Western consumer culture. And I saw them being pulled and pushed into a city where they were suddenly competing for scarce jobs. And the centralization of this top-down system led to conflict between groups that had lived side by side, in the case of Ladakh for 500 years, and in Bhutan, where I worked over a 5-year period in the 80s, between Hindus and Buddhists. So I see this virtual genocide coming out of this system that so removed people from the land and from the security of dependable community relationships and a dependable relationship with the land. Now, we can believe, many people have been taught that when you rely on the land and on other people, it's all fluctuating and it's all very unsafe. You need a secure job in the city. And it turns out that's the opposite of the truth. And so I witnessed this very dramatic change. I can also tell you that now, there's suicide, about one a month, mainly young people. And fairly early on, I was in touch with many other peoples across the world and visited many of them. And my sort of tribe was people who had experienced both of something more land-based, traditional, and the urban consumer culture, which is a monocultural reality since the rise of this Western system. And those people were aware of where happiness and health lie. And yet I helped to set up some organizations, a global eco-village network, a global forum on globalization. But it was, anyway, it's been difficult to see that in these last 50 years, there was much more awareness in the 60s and 70s. And then as a new form of globalization was taking off in the late 80s, these voices were silenced. There's been a lot of pressure to prevent the truth of what people want and the truth of what they're doing and the truth about what makes us healthy, both spiritually and physically. But now I see another opening it started opening up a bit after 2008 when we had this financial crisis and the world was told that, these banks must be able to continue speculating on our lives. They must be able to play around with our mortgages because they're too big to fail. And from that, there were more people beginning to look at the economy. And so now, particularly, I guess, since COVID, well, more steadily since 2008, there's a rise in awareness, and there are more people willing to look at the global economic system and much more interested in localization. So I feel encouraged, and I hope that before I die, I'm 78 now, and I'm hoping that in the next 5-6 years, we'll see this awareness growing, because to fix this practically would be a lot easier for governments than to continue going against what the planet and people need, going against the life of diversity, the life that we need, and imposing an artificial monoculture. It's not working and it's not going to work. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next 5-6 years.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm curious, what's the healthy correlation between localization of economy and a global body of economy? So let's say, if we see a lot of side effects of let's say things that don't function well, how would this look like when it's healthy? So when there's a healthy combination of both?
Well, first of all, I think we need to distinguish very importantly between international collaboration and one centralized, top-down, monocultural economy. So first of all, we need international collaboration at every level. And that includes international information exchange, collaboration at every level. Now, in terms of what I'm trying to build up is a global movement. So, because we're all being affected by two systems. One of them is an artificial, man-made system that started with enclosures and slavery and had behind it the burning of witches and the more decentralized ways of living, nature-connected ways of living. So that one man-made artificial system is having an impact across the entire world. And the other system is Mother Gaia, with infinite diversity, constant change, and interdependence and flow that, as we know, nothing has a static separate existence. Everything is in this flow and dialogue. So to come back in these deep connections between humans and that living Mother Gaia, it needs to be localized. It requires deeper ongoing bonds of dancing with real life. It can never function as one way of doing things. It can never function with this one genetically modified seed or this one species of potato. No, people are waking up to the heirloom adapted species of animals, of plants, and they're bringing them back. And they're seeing that's how they can produce far more food per acre of land. Small, diversified, job-rich farms can produce vastly more food. So the lie that we're too many people to go back to the land needs to be exposed. We need people on the land. We need people to replace blind, stupid machinery, which impose these monolithic hybrids, which use lots of fossil fuels. We need to tend to every plant, to every animal with more care, just as we need to care for one another with more people. But we're strangled in a system that makes energy and resources artificially cheap and labor too expensive. So the collaboration and the global commitment to supporting people and planet and real health, we need that urgently from the movements, with governments, and in business. But those businesses need to, over a period, choose, are they going to be, is Mitsubishi going to be Japanese, or does he want to jump off and be Swedish, or is General Motors going to be American? Because they cannot anymore continue to roam the world and blackmail our governments into letting them have total freedom, no rules, no taxes, while everybody else is squeezed with inefficient bureaucratic regulations and taxes. Now, this squeezing of everybody else leads to many business people being completely opposed to government regulation. So it's very understandable that with the bigger picture, people will understand that, yes, we need to change those regulations to make them much more localized and much more accountable to diversity. But at the same time, we need to reverse the situation so that global corporations will be regulated. They will come back to belong to a nation state. That's how a shift could start happening. Some people think that's impossible. They think those corporations have far too much power. But I'm basically convinced they only have that power because most people haven't understood what's going on. And they end up caught up in a very polarizing blindness of left and right, which is meaningless now, truly meaningless. Both left and right governments all around the world have been handing over more and more power to these global corporations. And that's now where the real power is, because no one has been paying attention to the global. And people are starting to now. And I'm hoping that our approach of really encouraging big picture thinking, so it's not some narrow anger, it's not some narrow targeting of individuals or individual corporations, but it's really looking at the system and understanding what could serve it. So in the long run, we would need a sort of global environmental protection that would realize that these monolithic solutions like genetically modified seeds or nuclear power or plastering all the earth with solar panels so that global trade has more energy doesn't serve people's needs. So there would be a protective, like, World Environment Organization instead of a World Trade Organization. But that doesn't mean that this body would impose how you're going to farm in Austria, in the Alps, or in the heat of Spain, or in the, mountains of the Alps. You're not going to be imposing the madness that the European Union already does, with rules about when you're supposed to harvest and preventing heirloom seeds from being grown and sold. So we're having a commercial interest, stifling and preventing diversity. So this environment organization would protect against corporate commercial monoculture while simultaneously being very engaged in decentralizing and supporting more local knowledge adapted to diversity.
Yeah, it's interesting as I listen to you, and I also apply this to our field of work, like looking at systems and systemic traumatization, and what are the systems that are traumatized. So colonialism, Holocaust, racism, genocides, wars, like created huge wounds, and those wounds are far from healed. So they're still residing in our collective unconscious and in our ancestry, in our epigenetics, and they have effects. And I think when I listen to you, on the one hand, I hear also that what we can still sense and feel is what we can respond to when certain things that are too big become abstract. So you lose the sense. So you lose also the sense making. So once it's abstract, it's easier to disconnect from it because it seems too big, too far away, too not me. And then there's a certain, and that combined with the trauma absence creates indifference. And I think that indifference is also what I hear you speak to, that many people didn't pay enough attention or don't pay enough attention because it seems like too much, too far. And the more we bring it back into like a local system that we can connect to, that we can also feel and sense because it's in our sphere of influence, we're also more engaged. And so then we also have more impact and agency. So that sounds really beautiful and important, I think. And that's why I think the work that you're doing also combined with the systemic understanding of trauma, I think is important, because I would even argue that that as there is a certain, like, trauma is pretty pandemic in the world, and as we know, and you have been to many also indigenous populations around the world, the hurt that has been created through colonialization is tremendous, and that's only one ring around the world that is like that impact, but there are many others. So I would even say that the call for a sustainable society can't work fully without the sustainable interior, because trauma stress will always exhaust natural resources in our body. So actually, if we have billions of people that carry some sort of trauma, even if it's just 5 or 10% of overconsumption of energy in our own systems, so we are not able to build a system that is not exhausting natural resources. And so that's why I love the dance or the interplay between your body of work and the understanding also of systemic trauma, because I think both can show symptoms or become the remedy. Like the trauma work can support your vision, and your vision is also a remedy for the trauma work, because the more like we reconnect to nature, it's what many people do when they heal their trauma, they go to nature.
Yeah, and also the reconnection to community. Yeah, I'd love it. I'd love it if we can also talk more about that in the future, how to collaborate and look more at that. Because I know you agree that, we have to look both at the inner and the outer. And sometimes people who understand about trauma fall into the trap of believing only once I've completely sorted that out, I have time for the outer. But again, like I was saying, we're seeing that some of this coming together actually does reduce the damage of trauma. It doesn't, it doesn't do complete healing, but then that can also start the journey of doing the deeper trauma work. And so if we can work at both ends, and that is, yeah, I think you've seen, the New Age movement ended up also with this idea that once there's peace inside me, then there'll be peace in the world. But in the meanwhile, by not looking at these crazy or, changes in policy that were so increasing the traumatic pressure on all of us. And so, right now, the trauma for the average person to just stay in place, to just be able to pay for food on the table and a roof over their head, that's now becoming a traumatic situation for more and more people. And so, again, whatever we can do to raise awareness about that and reduce that pressure while doing the inner work.
I completely agree. Also with what you said, the inside outside work. And sometimes even mindfulness or spirituality becomes enrolled in the trauma aversion to the world that is difficult. Instead
Yes.
of that, the integration helps us to engage more with the world that's difficult so that we can really change certain structures in the world. And that combination is truly powerful, as you said.
Yeah.
And I completely resonate with that the inner and outer work are both very important together, and they reinforce each other. If done well, I think they are really good partners.
Yeah, no, definitely. That I'm definitely seeing that, and that is basically what we try to encourage. But it's also difficult, in our work because from that indigenous culture experience, and seeing the system coming in from the outside and affecting everything. So we're talking about education and infrastructure and taxes and inner work and dance and song and male female balance, old and young. By the way, one of the key lessons from indigenous culture was this beautiful marriage between the youngest and the oldest. And it was so obvious that when you segregate children into these monocultures, it's like factory farming. And, when you just, I often like to talk about, one room with 31-year-olds. It's just like elbows and screaming and no one able to lend a hand to the other. And it was so beautiful out there to see, the 5-year-old brother carrying the little baby on his body or going arm in arm with his 80-year-old grandmother, never ashamed that this wasn't masculine enough. But I realized that the maintenance of the feminine in men and women was key to the healing, which I think in the trauma work is also
Absolutely.
urgent. Yeah.
Yeah, and also as you're saying, it's like also the like a healthy place for eldership and wisdom in our world, and the guidance that comes from elders. I think, and also the intergenerational learning that you described is so beautiful. Like it's a both way learning stream all the time, and that's so fruitful. And if we interrupt it, then a lot of dissonance starts to happen in the society. Yeah, that's beautiful. That resonates a lot. I mean, many things you're saying resonate a lot for me. And I see our time. I wanted to see if there's anything in specific that we didn't talk about that you think is important for our listeners, or anything you want to leave our listeners with, any
Yeah.
encouragement or practice or
Yeah.
anything.
I would say that sharing the big picture is a type of education and it's skipped over. It's an activism. It's an activism that's needed to convey the bigger picture in a loving, non-aggressive way, without making people feel guilty and blame themselves. In fact, the bigger picture removes that self-blame. So sharing the big picture, please think of this as one of the most important actions you can take. Please share our films. The most recent one is called Closer to Home. And another one is just a series of case studies of local initiatives. It's called The Power of Local. We have a localization action guide and many other tools And if you wanted to try to set up a local scheme, we would also be happy to try to help you, even though we're a very small organization. So we can also use financial support, which we're normally not asking for, but we're going to be doing that this year. And we're going to be having a big summit in Ladakh, or Little Tibet, in August next year, the beginning of August. And maybe you'll want to join us. It'll be an amazing summit of people from all over the world, from every continent, who are working from both that inner and outer awareness, and who are strong and brave and healthy, wonderful people. We had a summit like that last year in Bristol, and it was so nourishing for all of us. So if you want to join us, please come to our website, localfutures.org. It will be my 50th anniversary going back to Ladakh. Yeah, so that's one of our biggest projects for this year.
Oh, beautiful.
I really hope we can collaborate more, Thomas. Really, so
I would love that. I would love that. Let's stay connected, and I would love that. I think there's a lot of resonance and a lot of mutuality and mutual synergy here. So yes, I would love that. That's amazing. It's so lovely to get to know you and to be in resonance with you and learn from you. And thank you for joining this podcast, Point of Relation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Point of Relation with Thomas Hübl. Stay connected and get updates about new episodes by visiting our website, pointofrelationpodcast.com, and by subscribing to the Thomas Hübl YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share about us with your community on social media. Thank you. We appreciate your support.